Welcome to one of the most disturbing cases ever documented in Charleston, South Carolina. The year was 1842, a time when Charleston stood as the crown jewel of the South, its streets lined with palmetto trees casting long shadows across weathered cobblestone. The salt-tinged air carried rumors that traveled from the grand estates on Meeting Street down to the quarters hidden behind them. It began with a notice in the Charleston Mercury dated May 7, 1842. A small announcement, easily overlooked: marriage license issued to widow Catherine Ashford, age 39, and Daniel Hayes, age 28. What the newspaper failed to mention was that Daniel Hayes had, until recently, been considered property rather than a person on the Ashford estate. The subsequent scandal would tear apart not only the Ashford family, but reveal secrets buried beneath the foundations of Charleston society for generations. Catherine Ashford, born Catherine Beaumont, came from one of Carolina's oldest families. Her grandfather had been among the first settlers in the colony, arriving in 1670 with the original Lord's proprietors. The Beaumonts accumulated vast wealth through indigo plantations along the Ashley River, their fortunes built on the backs of hundreds of enslaved people. By all accounts, Catherine grew up sheltered from hardship in the family's four-story mansion overlooking White Point Gardens. According to parish records from St. Philip's Episcopal Church, Catherine was married at 18 to Jonathan Ashford, a widower 32 years her senior, owner of a rice plantation just outside the city limits. The marriage joined two fortunes, two names respected throughout the Carolinas. Jonathan Ashford's first wife had died of scarlet fever, leaving him with a son, Robert, who was only 3 years younger than his new stepmother. The Ashford household was managed with precision, at least according to the journals of Elizabeth Middleton, a cousin who visited the plantation in the summer of 1829. Cousin Catherine runs her household with remarkable efficiency, wrote Elizabeth. Though she appears delicate, she maintains strict order among the servants. Jonathan speaks little at meals, leaving Catherine to manage conversation. There is a peculiar heaviness that falls when he does speak. Those who knew the family noted that Jonathan was often away on business in Savannah or Richmond, leaving Catherine to manage the plantation. What few realized was how much time she spent in the company of a house servant, known only as Rachel in household ledgers. Rachel had arrived at the plantation in 1825, purchased from a trader in Savannah. What makes this significant is that Rachel arrived with her son, then a boy of 10 years old. His name was Daniel. Tax records from Charleston County indicate that by 1838, the Ashford plantation housed 52 enslaved individuals. Among them, Daniel Hayes was listed as house servant 1 of only 3 given such designation. Most were field hands, their names recorded only as numbers in inventory lists. But Daniel appears repeatedly in household account books, first as Rachel's boy, then simply as Daniel, and finally as Daniel Hayes. The addition of a surname was unusual and raises questions that have haunted Charleston historians for decades. According to Dr. Margaret Sinclair, who studied the Ashford papers in 1967 before they mysteriously disappeared from the South Carolina Historical Society archives, Daniel was taught to read and write another unusual circumstance. The ledgers show purchases of books, writing materials, and even a globe specifically noted as for D.H.'s instruction, wrote Sinclair in her unpublished manuscript, Shadows on Meeting Street. Jonathan Ashford died in the cholera epidemic of 1839. His will, filed at the Charleston County Courthouse, left everything to Catherine with a substantial inheritance inheritance for his son, Robert, who by then was 36 and had his own plantation near Georgetown. The will contained an unusual provision. The servant Daniel Hayes shall remain in the employ of my wife and shall not be sold or transferred under any circumstances. This provision would later be scrutinized by attorneys when the scandal broke. Why would Jonathan Ashford specifically protect one servant? Irish records indicate Catherine observed a mourning period of exactly 1 year before she began to appear at social functions again. Neighbors noted that during this time, the Ashford household seemed to operate without disruption, despite the absence of its master. It was during this period that witnesses later reported seeing Catherine and Daniel Hayes in circumstances that raised eyebrows. Sarah Rutledge, who lived on the neighboring property, told investigators in 1842 that she had seen them walking together in the garden like companions rather than mistress and servant. A former housemaid, Hannah Mitchell, whose testimony was recorded by a court clerk, claimed she had once entered the library without knocking and found them standing unusually close, Daniel's hand withdrawing quickly from Catherine's shoulder. They jumped apart like they'd been scalded, she reportedly said. Mrs. Ashford dismissed me right quick, but her face was flushed in a way I'd never seen before. Winter turned to spring and spring to summer. The weeks passed in a strange, tense quiet. Catherine Ashford began declining invitations to society events. Her cousin Thomas Beaumont wrote in a letter to his sister that he had called upon Catherine in March of 1841 and found her altered in demeanor, distracted in conversation, and dressed with a simplicity uncharacteristic of her station. He noted that Daniel Hayes had served them tea, and that Catherine addressed him with a familiarity that I found deeply unsettling. The letter continues. When I inquired after her health, she answered that she had never felt more alive. There was something in her eyes I did not recognize, something that reminded me not of our gentle cousin, but of someone harboring a dangerous secret. What happened next was documented in a series of increasingly urgent letters between Robert Ashford and his uncle, Judge William Ashford of Charleston. Robert, having heard rumors from former house servants who had connections to the plantation, wrote on January 15th, 1842, I have received disturbing reports regarding my stepmother's conduct. I pray they are malicious fabrications, but I fear there may be truth to them. I intend to visit the plantation unannounced next month to ascertain the situation for myself. Judge Ashford replied, cautioning restraint, but his letter contained an ominous line. There have been whispers in certain circles. It would be prudent to address this matter privately before it becomes fodder for public speculation. According to court records filed later, Robert Ashford arrived at the plantation on February 20th, 1842, during a thunderstorm that had turned the roads to rivers of mud. The carriage tracks leading to the main house were still visible the next morning when the sheriff arrived, summoned by what was described in official reports as a disturbance of significant nature. What exactly transpired during Robert's visit was never fully disclosed in public records. What is known is that Robert Ashford left the plantation before dawn the following day and rode directly to the sheriff's office in Charleston. By noon, Daniel Hayes had been taken into custody on charges that were later dismissed. Catherine Ashford was not arrested, but according to church records, she was asked not to attend services at St. Philip's for a period of reflection. The silence that followed was broken 10 weeks later by the marriage announcement. Catherine Ashford had somehow secured freedom papers for Daniel Hayes, and then, in act of defiance that shocked Charleston society, married him in a small ceremony performed by Reverend Thomas Parker, a Methodist minister known for his abolitionist sympathies. The ceremony took place not not in a church, but in the drawing room of the Ashford home, with only two witnesses present, Rachel, Daniel's mother, and a lawyer from Boston named Edward Sullivan, who had arrived in Charleston 5 days earlier. According to hotel registers from the Charleston Hotel, Sullivan stayed exactly 3 nights in Charleston before departing for Wilmington and then north to Boston, never to return to South Carolina. The reaction was swift and merciless. The Charleston City Council convened an emergency session on May 10, 1842. The minutes of this meeting were later expunged, but according to newspaper accounts, they discussed a moral emergency threatening the very fabric of our society. Robert Ashford filed a petition to have his stepmother declared mentally incompetent and to assume control of the family estate. Judge William Ashford recused himself from the case, citing family connection, but privately wrote to the governor requesting intervention. The Beaumont family publicly disowned Catherine, placing notices in newspapers as far away as Richmond and Atlanta, stating that she was no longer recognized as a daughter of our line. What happened next has been pieced together from fragmentary accounts, as many records were deliberately destroyed in what appears to have been an attempt to erase the scandal from Charleston's history. According to a letter found in 1961 during renovations of an old house on Broad Street, a group of 15 men visited the Ashford plantation on the night of May 15th. The letter, written by someone identifying himself only as a witness to abomination, described how the men surrounded the house carrying torches. They called for Hayes to come out and face justice. The widow appeared on the veranda instead, a pistol in her hands. She said only, "This is my property and my choice. Leave now or face the consequences." There was something in her bearing that gave even the angriest among them pause. The men retreated that night, but returned with the sheriff 3 days later. They found the house empty, the furniture covered with sheets, as if the occupants had left in an orderly fashion rather than fled in panic. A search of the premises revealed nothing unusual except for a small room off the main library that had been emptied of all contents. According to Hannah Mitchell, the former housemaid, whose testimony was recorded months later, that room had been Daniel's study, where Mrs. Ashford taught him to read and write, and where they often spent evenings together. They cleared it out complete, Mitchell stated. Not a book, not a paper, nothing left to show what went on there for all those years. The disappearance of Catherine Ashford and Daniel Hayes launched what newspapers delicately called the most extensive search for persons of interest in Charleston County. History. Ports were watched, roads patrolled, neighboring states alerted. Robert Ashford hired private investigators from as far away as Philadelphia to trace their movements. Yet despite these efforts, no confirmed sighting was ever documented. It was as if they had vanished into the humid Carolina air. Rumors, however, multiplied. A station master in Wilmington reported seeing a white woman and a well-dressed black man boarding a northbound train the morning of May 16th. A ship captain in Baltimore told authorities he had transported a mixed-race couple to New York in late May, though he could not positively identify them from descriptions. Most intriguingly, a banker in Toronto, Canada, reported in September of 1842 that a woman matching Catherine's description had attempted to access funds using documentation from the Boston lawyer Edward Sullivan. As months passed without resolution, the scandal began to transform into something else, a whispered legend, a cautionary tale told to young women of good families. The Ashford plantation fell into disrepair. Robert Ashford, having finally secured legal control of the property in December of 1842, sold it to a family from Virginia and never returned to Charleston. What he did with the 51 remaining enslaved people is not recorded in surviving documents, though a bill bill of sale in the Charleston County Archives shows that at least some were sold to a plantation in Mississippi. Rachel, Daniel's mother, was not among those listed in the sale. The investigation might have ended there, filed away as an unsolved mystery, had it not been for what was discovered 7 years later. In 1849, workers renovating the old Ashford house for its new owners made a disturbing discovery beneath the floorboards of the small study that had been emptied. There, carefully wrapped in oilcloth, they found a leather-bound journal. The journal was turned over to local authorities and eventually made its way to Judge William Ashford, who was said to have read it in one sitting before locking it away in his personal safe. The judge died 5 weeks later of what was described as apoplexy, a stroke brought on by extreme agitation. The journal's contents were never made public. After Judge Ashford's death, his widow claimed to have burned it without reading it herself, calling it a vessel of contamination. However, before its destruction, the judge's clerk, a young man named Samuel Whitfield, admitted years later to having made a partial copy of certain passages. Whitfield, who eventually moved to Philadelphia and became involved in abolitionist causes, shared these passages with a researcher from Yale University in 1865. According to that researcher's notes, found in the Yale archives in 1964, the journey belonged to Catherine Ashford and contained entries dating back to 1825, the year Rachel and her son Daniel arrived at the plantation. The earliest entries described Catherine's initial interest in the boy. The child shows remarkable intelligence. Jay says, "I indulge my curiosity too much, but there is something in the boy's eyes, a quickness of understanding, that I have not seen in any child, white or black. Today I showed him my book of botanical illustrations, and he named each plant correctly after hearing me say it only once." Later entries documented Catherine's decision to teach him to read, conducted in secret after her husband expressly forbade it. Jay would be furious if he knew, but what harm can come from knowledge? The boy absorbs everything I teach him with a hunger that reminds me of myself at his age. Before I was told that a lady's education should consist mainly of accomplishments rather than substance. As the years passed, the entries became more personal. One passage from 1833, when Daniel would have been around 18, read, "I find myself watching for him in the mornings the way the sun catches his profile as he tends the roses beneath my window. I tell myself it is maternal pride in his accomplishments, but I fear it may be something else entirely, something I dare not name even here." By 1838, a year before her husband's death, Catherine wrote, "We spoke of Keats today, and as he recited the verses, I saw not the child I taught, but the man he has become. I closed the book and sent him away. Later I wept, though I cannot say precisely why." The most revealing passages, according to the Yale researcher's notes, came after Jonathan Ashford's death. With Jay gone, the house breathes differently. Dee and I walked in the garden at twilight, discussing plans for the south field. For the first time, I asked his opinion, not as a formality, but because I truly wanted to know his thoughts. Our hands brushed as we examined a damaged magnolia. Neither of us acknowledged it, but neither did we move away, and later we no longer pretend. When the house is quiet and the doors locked, he comes to the library. We read together, talk together, exist together in a way I never thought possible with any human being. He knows more of my soul than anyone ever has. I've begun to make inquiries about laws in other states. There must be a place where we can live without fear. The final entry copied by Whitfield was dated May 2nd, 1842, just days before the marriage announcement appeared in the newspaper. "Tomorrow everything changes. Edward Sullivan has secured the necessary papers. Once the ceremony is performed, we must leave immediately. Dee fears for his mother's safety, but she insists on staying behind. at least initially. She says she will join us later, that someone must maintain appearances while we establish ourselves elsewhere. I have sewn what jewels and banknotes I could gather into the linings of our traveling clothes. The Northern abolitionists, Edward, introduced me to have arranged a network of safe houses. I know the danger. I know what we risk. But for the first time in my life, I am choosing rather than being chosen for. The Yale researcher's notes included a tantalizing postscript. Whitfield claimed that in 1857, while visiting Toronto on business, he encountered a woman he believed to be Catherine Ashford. She was using another name which he did not record, and was living in a modest but comfortable house in a mixed-race neighborhood. When he approached her, she denied being Catherine Ashford, but invited him to tea nonetheless. During their conversation, she mentioned poetry, specifically Keats, which triggered his memory of the journal. As he was leaving, he noticed a portrait on the wall of a black man in formal attire. When he inquired about it, the woman smiled and said only, "My late husband. He passed 4 years ago from consumption." Whitfield never reported this encounter to authorities. The Ashford scandal gradually faded from public memory, overshadowed by the growing national crisis that would eventually lead to civil war. The plantation was sold twice more before being largely destroyed during Sherman's campaign through South Carolina in 1865. The land was eventually subdivided and developed. Today, a residential neighborhood stands where the main house once was, and few residents know the history beneath their feet. The Ashford name survives only in a small street off Meeting and in the archives of the South Carolina Historical Society, where researchers occasionally stumble upon fragments of the story while looking for something else entirely. In 1963, during construction of a shopping plaza near the original plantation site, workers uncovered a small metal box buried approximately 4 feet below ground. Inside was a cameo brooch, a pressed magnolia bloom preserved between glass plates, and a folded paper containing a lock of hair tied with silk ribbon. The items were turned over to the South Carolina Historical Society, where they remained uncatalogued until 1967, when Dr. Margaret Sinclair examined them as part of her research into the Ashford case. In her notes, she observed that the cameo appeared to match one described in Catherine Ashford's wedding inventory from her first marriage. The pressed flower was identified as a rare variety of magnolia that had been cultivated on the Ashford plantation. The lock of hair, when examined under microscope, appeared to be from 2 different individuals. Intertwined, Dr. Sinclair's research was never published. According to colleagues, she became increasingly obsessed with the Ashford case, convinced that there were more documents to be found. In the spring of 1967, she traveled to Toronto to follow up on the Whitfield account. She wrote to her department chair at the University of South Carolina that she had made a breakthrough and would return with evidence that will rewrite this chapter of Carolina history. 3 weeks later, her hotel room was found empty, her research notes missing. The only item remaining was a single pressed magnolia bloom, similar to the one found in the metal box placed on her pillow. Sinclair herself was located 5 days later in a hospital, disoriented and unable to account for the missing days or the disappearance of her research materials. She abandoned her work on the Ashford case shortly thereafter and refused to discuss it until her death in 1972. Story of Catherine Ashford and Daniel Hayes exists now in the liminal space between documented history and legend. Parts of it can be verified through court records, newspapers, and personal correspondence. Other elements remain speculative, pieced together from fragments, whispers, and silences nuances in the historical record. What is certain is that in the spring of 1842, a wealthy white widow and a black man she had once owned according to the laws of South Carolina disappeared together, leaving behind a society scandalized not just by their defiance of racial boundaries, but by the implication that their relationship had developed over years, perhaps even while Catherine's husband was still alive within the very household that was meant to embody Southern social order. The mystery that remains unsolved is not just what happened to Catherine and Daniel after their disappearance, but what happened in the years before, in the quiet moments of teaching and learning, in conversations over books and glances exchanged across rooms where others saw only mistress and servant. What words passed between them, what promises were made, and perhaps most disturbingly to those who discovered the truth, how many other households harbored similar secrets behind their respectable facades, how many other relationships existed in the shadows, defying the strict boundaries upon which Southern society was built. In 1973, shortly after Dr. Sinclair's death, a graduate student cataloging her effects found a sealed envelope with instructions that it not be opened until 50 years after her death. The university administration, concerned about potential legal issues, overrode this request and opened the envelope in the presence of attorneys. According to a staff member who was present but requested anonymity when interviewed in 1976, the envelope contained a single sheet of paper with an address in Toronto and the words, "They survived, they lived. Their descendants walk among us still." The paper was reportedly seized by university officials and has never been made public. The address, according to the staff member, was for a cemetery. Today, the story of Catherine Ashford and Daniel Hayes surfaces occasionally in academic papers, in specialized books on antebellum Southern society, or in whispered ghost tours of Charleston's historic district. Tour guides point to a certain house on Meeting Street, not the original Ashford residence, but one nearby, and claim that on certain nights, particularly in May, witnesses have reported seeing a light moving from room to room as if someone is searching for something or someone. Others claim to have heard the faint sound of poetry being recited, though they can never quite make out the words. These are merely tourist tales, embellishments for the curious, with no basis in documented fact. What remains factual is this. In 1842, Catherine Ashford and Daniel Hayes chose each other in a society that forbade such choices. They vanished rather than submit to separation, and somewhere perhaps in a forgotten archive, in an attic trunk, or buried beneath a modern foundation, there may still exist evidence of what happened to them after they stepped out of recorded history and into the realm of legend. Until such evidence surfaces, their story remains one of the most disturbing chapters in Charleston's history, not because of any violence or supernatural element, but because it challenged the very foundations upon which an entire society was built, revealing the fragile nature of social conventions and the extraordinary measures some would take to maintain or defy them. In the words attributed to the Yale researcher who examined Whitfield's notes, the most terrifying aspect of the Ashford case is not what it reveals about the two individuals at its center, but what it suggests about countless others whose stories were never documented, whose defiance never made it into historical records, whose lives were lived in desperate silence or erased entirely from memory. How many Catherine Ashfords and Daniel Hayes existed across the American South, their stories buried with them? And what does that tell us about the society that worked so diligently to ensure those stories would never be told? The question echoes still through the palmetto-lined squares of Charleston, along the shadowed banks of the Ashley River, and in the silent spaces between the pages of history books. In 1978, during the renovation of an old colonial-era customs house in Albany, New York, workers workers discovered a hidden compartment behind a loose brick in the basement wall. Inside was a small leather pouch containing 3 letters addressed to Mrs. Rebecca Hayes at an address in Buffalo. The letters, dated 1844 through 1846, were written in a flowing feminine hand and signed only with the initial R. Historians later identified this as likely being Rachel Daniel Hayes's mother, who supposedly remained in South Carolina after Catherine and Daniel fled. The letters themselves contained no explicit mention of Charleston or the scandal, but spoke of a mutual acquaintance who had relocated north and was anxious for news from home. The most revealing passage came in the 3rd letter, dated November 22, 1846. Our mutual friend asks after you constantly. The situation here has grown more difficult since you departed. The new master shows no kindness. Many have been sold away. I keep the secret you entrusted to me close to my heart. Though there have been those who question me still, I tell them nothing. The item you left in my care remains secure where we discussed. When my time comes, I pray I will join you in the place where people may live according to their hearts, rather than the dictates of others. What makes these letters significant is not just their content, but their very existence. They suggest that Rachel eventually made her way north, contrary to official records which listed her as having died on the Ashford plantation in 1843. More importantly, they indicate an ongoing correspondence, a network of communication that allowed news to travel between South Carolina and New York. Despite the efforts of authorities to sever all connections between Catherine Ashford, Daniel Hayes, and their former lives, further evidence of this network emerged in 1965 when a historian researching the Underground Railroad discovered account books belonging to Edward Sullivan, the Boston lawyer who had witnessed Catherine and Daniel's marriage. The books, found in the archives of a Quaker meeting house in Massachusetts, contained coded entries that scholars eventually deciphered as records of funds transferred to various locations, along established escape routes for enslaved people seeking freedom. One entry dated June 10, 1842, noted, "Special arrangement for TAH package delivered successfully to Toronto. Additional funds released as agreed for 7 years of security and silence." Dr. Marcus Williams, who studied these records before they were reclassified and restricted from public access in 1968, wrote in his private journal, "The Sullivan accounts reveal that the Ashford-Hayes escape was not merely a spontaneous act of defiance, but part of a carefully orchestrated plan that may have been years in the making. The level of financial commitment enough to ensure security and silence for 7 years suggests not only substantial resources, but a remarkable degree of forethought." One must wonder, when exactly did Catherine Ashford begin planning her escape from Charleston society? Was it after her husband's death, or had she been laying the groundwork even before becoming a widow? This question became even more pertinent in 1970, when construction workers demolishing an old rice mill near the original Ashford plantation discovered a hidden space beneath the floorboards. Inside was a small wooden chest containing what appeared to be teaching materials, a primer, a slate, several pencils, and a copy of Keats's collected poems. The items were estimated to date from the 1820s or early 1830s years before Jonathan Ashford's death. Most significant was a small notebook filled with handwriting exercises lines of repeated phrases, gradually improving in quality. One page contained the sentence written over and over with increasing skill, "I am Daniel Hayes. I am a man. I have a mind." At the bottom of the page, in different handwriting, presumably Catherine's, were the words, "Excellent progress. You have truly earned your name today." The discovery suggested that Catherine had indeed been teaching, Daniel in secret while her husband was still alive, creating a hidden space where they could meet without arousing suspicion. The rice mill, according to plantation records, was rarely used after newer equipment was installed closer to the main fields in 1828. It would have provided an ideal location for clandestine lessons far enough from the main house to avoid detection, yet not so distant as to raise questions about Catherine's movements. What remains unclear is how and when their relationship evolved from teacher and student to something more intimate. No documents exist that explicitly confirm the nature of their connection before Jonathan Ashford's death. However, a letter from Catherine to her cousin Anne Beaumont, dated September 25, 1837, 2 years before she became a widow, contains a passage that some historians have interpreted as a veiled reference. I find myself living two lives these days, the one visible to society where I play my assigned role with precision, and another that exists in moments stolen from the day, in conversations that could never be overheard, in thoughts I dare not speak aloud. It is in this second life, dear Anne, that I find myself most truly alive. Is that not the strangest confession to feel most authentic when one is most in hiding? The dual life Catherine described became increasingly difficult to maintain after her husband's death. As a widow, she would have been subject to greater scrutiny, particularly regarding her management of the plantation and treatment of the enslaved people she now owned outright. Several accounts from that period note changes in her behavior. Margaret Pringle, a neighbor who recorded her observations in a private journal discovered in 1963, wrote in October 1839, "Called upon Catherine Ashford today, 8 months after Jonathan's passing, found her changed in ways I cannot quite articulate. There's a restlessness about her, a barely contained energy that seems at odds with her mourning dress." When I mentioned the difficulty of managing such a large property alone, she smiled in a manner I found disconcerting and said, "I am not as alone as one might think." I left feeling strangely unsettled, as if I had glimpsed something not meant for public view. As Catherine's behavior drew more attention, so too did Daniel Hayes's position within the household. According to testimony given later by house servants, he had begun to take on responsibilities unusual for someone of his status. Hannah Mitchell, the housemaid, reported that by early 1841, Daniel was effectively managing the plantation's accounts, receiving visitors when Catherine was indisposed, and even corresponding with merchants in Charleston on behalf of the estate. He sat at the master's desk, Mitchell told investigators, used the master's pen, spoke with the master's authority, and Mrs. Ashford, she just smiled like it was the most natural thing in the world. This gradual shift in roles, this blurring of the strict boundaries that governed Southern society, could not continue indefinitely without consequences. The catalyst, as previously mentioned, was Robert Ashford's unannounced visit in February 1842. What exactly he witnessed remains unconfirmed, but according to a letter he wrote to Judge William Ashford immediately after fleeing the plantation, it was a violation of natural order so profound that I could not remain beneath that roof for another hour without fear of committing violence. He described finding Catherine and Daniel in a situation that admitted no innocent interpretation, though he refrained from providing specific details out of respect for the family name. The immediate aftermath of Robert's discovery set in motion a series of events that would ultimately lead to Catherine and Daniel's marriage and subsequent disappearance. What is less known is that during the 3 months between Robert's visit and their marriage, Catherine began systematically liquidating her assets. Records at the Bank of Charleston show that between February 25th and April 20th, 1842, she withdrew significant sums, converting them to easily transportable forms such as banknotes and letters of credit. She also sold several pieces of jewelry through a broker in Savannah, as documented in a receipt found among Edward Sullivan's papers. Most tellingly, she transferred legal ownership of a small property she had inherited from her mother in Boston to a corporation whose sole trustee was Sullivan himself. These financial maneuvers suggest that Catherine was preparing not just for flight, but for a new life beyond South Carolina. The careful legal arrangements, conducted through intermediaries and across state lines, indicate an awareness of the challenges they would face. Catherine and Daniel would need not only to escape, but to establish themselves somewhere their past could not follow them, somewhere they could construct new identities, secure from both legal pursuit and social ostracism. The most compelling evidence of this preparation comes from a deposition given in Combin in 1844 by a former clerk at a Charleston printing shop. During a legal dispute over Robert Ashford's claim to his stepmother's property, the clerk testified that in March 1842, a well-dressed black man he later identified as Daniel Hayes had commissioned business cards and correspondence paper for Mr. Daniel Hayes, importer of fine textiles and goods. The address on the cards was in Toronto. According to the clerk, Hayes explained that he was acting on behalf of his employer, who was expanding business interests northward. The clerk thought nothing of it at the time, but recognized the significance after the scandal broke. The business cards represented more than just a cover story. They were evidence of a future Catherine and Daniel had envisioned together, one where he would be not property, but proprietor, not servant, but merchant. The choice of Toronto was strategic. As part of British Canada, it offered distance from U.S. laws regarding fugitive slaves. Its cosmopolitan nature and substantial mixed-race population provided relative anonymity. Most importantly, its status as a commercial hub would make a new textile import business seem unremarkable. Just one more enterprise in a city built on trade. The actual journey from Charleston to Toronto remains largely undocumented, though fragments suggest they traveled by ship to Boston, where Sullivan provided temporary shelter and new identification papers, then overland through New York State and across the Canadian border. A receipt for passage on the schooner Seabird from Charleston to Boston, dated May 17, 1842, was found among Sullivan's effects. It listed two passengers, Mrs. E. Smith and Mr. J. Smith, described as aunt and nephew traveling on family business. What is known with reasonable certainty is that by September 1842, someone matching Catherine's description was attempting to access funds in Toronto. As previously noted, by December of that year, city directories list a Daniel Hayes, importer, with a small shop on King Street and a residence on Adelaide Street. The following year's directory adds Mrs. Rebecca Hayes at the same residence address. No mention is made of their racial identities or origins. Life in Toronto would have presented its own challenges, though of a different nature than those they faced in South Carolina. While they may have escaped the legal consequences of their actions, they would have needed to construct a plausible narrative about their past, to explain Catherine's accent, to account for any differences in their appearances or mannerisms that might raise questions. The success of their textile business would have depended not just on commercial acumen, but on their ability to present themselves convincingly as whatever they claimed to be. According to the fragmentary evidence available, they appear to have succeeded, at least for a time. Trade records from the port of Toronto show that Hayes's import business maintained steady, if modest, activity through the 1840s. Tax assessments indicate a gradual improvement in their financial circumstances, with the business expanding to larger premises in 1848. Church records from a small Methodist congregation note the regular attendance and charitable contributions of Mr. and Mrs. Hayes, described as a couple of varied heritage, a designation vague enough to cover numerous possible backgrounds without inviting detailed scrutiny. The most intimate glimpse into their Toronto life comes from an unexpected source, a diary kept by a young woman named Emma Wilson, who worked as an assistant in their shop from 1846 to 1848. The diary, discovered in a family collection in 1972, contains several entries describing her employers. Mrs. Hayes speaks with a southern accent, she wrote in one entry, but tries very hard to soften it. She's always elegant, even in simple clothes, and treats everyone with the same courtesy, whether they are wealthy customers or street vendors. Mr. Hayes runs the business with great attention to detail. They seem devoted to each other in a quiet way. They often exchange glances when they think no one is watching. Little private communications that make me hope someday I might find such understanding with someone. In another entry, Emma noted, "Today, a customer from New York questioned Mr. Hayes about his background. He replied simply that he had been raised in the South but preferred the climate of Canada, both meteorological and social." The man pressed further, asking if Mrs. Hayes was of European descent. There was a tension in the shop I had never felt before. Mr. Hayes smiled and said, "My wife and I have found that Toronto asks fewer questions than other places, which is precisely why we chose it." The customer left shortly after. Mrs. Hayes's hands were shaking as she arranged the fabric bolts, though she pretended nothing had happened. This incident highlights the precarious nature of their situation. Despite establishing new identities and achieving a measure of acceptance in Toronto society, the threat of discovery remained. One visitor from the South, one chance encounter with someone who had known them in their previous lives, could potentially unravel everything they had built. This persistent vulnerability likely explains why, according to Toronto property records, the Hayes sold their business in 1853 and moved to a smaller, more remote community outside the city. The shop on King Street was purchased by a Scottish merchant, while their home address disappears from subsequent city directories. From this point forward, the documentary trail grows increasingly sparse. No records exist confirming Daniel Hayes's reported death from consumption around 1853, as mentioned in the account of Samuel Whitfield's chance meeting with Catherine. However, death records from the period are notoriously incomplete, particularly for smaller communities outside major urban centers. What can be verified is that in 1857, the year Whitfield claimed to have encountered Catherine, in Toronto, a Mrs. Rebecca Hayes, widow, purchased a small house in Yorkville, then a separate village north of Toronto. The property remained in her name until 1873, when ownership was transferred to a Miss Rachel Hayes, described in the deed as niece and sole heir. The appearance of this Rachel Hayes raises intriguing questions. No previous records mention Catherine and Daniel having a child or adopting one. However, the name's similarity to that of Daniel's mother suggests a possible connection. Could this Rachel have been Daniel's mother, who, according to the letters found in Albany, had eventually made her way north? Or might she have been a child born to Catherine and Daniel, named after her paternal grandmother? The latter possibility seems supported by an entry in the register of a small Episcopal church in Yorkville, recording the confirmation in 1865 of a Rachel Hayes, age 16. If accurate, this would place her birth around 1849, 7 years after Catherine and Daniel fled Charleston. Existence of a child would add yet another dimension to their story, not just a forbidden marriage, but a family created across the boundaries of race and class. that defined 19th century America would mean that somewhere, perhaps even today, there may be descendants of Catherine Ashford and Daniel Hayes, carrying their legacy without perhaps even knowing the extraordinary circumstances that brought their ancestors together. The final documented trace of Catherine herself appears in 1875, 33 years after she scandalized Charleston society. A notice in a Toronto newspaper announced the passing of Mrs. Rebecca Hayes, formerly of the United States, at the age of 72. Brief obituary mentioned that she was survived by her beloved granddaughter and would be remembered for her quiet strength, her appreciation of poetry, and her belief in the equality of all souls before God. She was buried in a small cemetery in Yorkville in a plot purchased years earlier that contained another grave, unmarked except for the dates 1814 to 1853, approximate lifespan of Daniel Hayes. In 1967, when Dr. Margaret Sinclair traveled to Toronto following Whitfield's account, she reportedly visited this cemetery. Whatever she found there, whatever breakthrough she claimed to have made, disappeared along with her research notes during her mysterious 5-day absence. By the time the cemetery was relocated for urban development in 1976, the graves had been moved to a common area without individual markers, erasing this final physical connection to Catherine and Daniel's story. And so we are left with fragments. Documents scattered across archives in South Carolina, New York, Massachusetts, and Ontario. Testimonies given decades after the events they describe. Objects found beneath floorboards and behind walls. Entries and diaries and letters never meant for public eyes. From these fragments, we can reconstruct the outlines of an extraordinary defiance, a rejection of the rigid boundaries that separated people by race and status, a claiming of human connection in a society that denied its possibility. What remains most elusive is not the factual record of what Catherine Ashford and Daniel Hayes did, but the intimate reality of who they were to each other. When did teacher and student become equals? When did respect transform into something deeper? What conversations took place in that hidden room at the abandoned rice mill over Keats's poetry and writing exercises? What promises were made in whispers that could not be overheard? How did they find the courage to imagine a future that everything in their world insisted could not exist? These questions linger in the silences between documented facts. They echo in the empty spaces where records should be but have been deliberately destroyed or concealed. They haunt the corners of Charleston's history, challenging the carefully constructed narrative of the antebellum South. The story of Catherine Ashford and Daniel Hayes offers no easy conclusions, no moral certainty. It is a reminder of the countless untold stories buried beneath official histories, the private defiances, the secret connections, the human hearts that refuse to conform to the rigid categories imposed upon them. As the Yale researcher noted in his final assessment of the case, what makes the Ashford affair so disturbing, even decades later, is not that it happened, but that it forces us to reconsider how many similar stories never came to light. If a woman of Catherine Ashford's social standing could maintain such a relationship for years, if she could eventually choose to abandon everything for it, how many others might have harbored similar feelings but lacked her resources or courage? The true history of human connection across the boundaries of race and class in America remains largely unwritten, existing only in fragments, whispers, and silences. In 1973, the same year Dr. Sinclair's sealed envelope was prematurely opened, An elderly woman visited the South Carolina Historical Society and asked to see any materials related to the Ashford plantation. According to the archivist who assisted her, she was in her 70s, well-dressed, with light brown skin and striking gray eyes. She spent several hours examining the available documents, taking careful notes. When asked about her interest in the subject, she replied that she was researching her family history. The archivist later recalled that as the woman was leaving, she paused at the display case containing the cameo brooch and pressed magnolia found in 1963. She stood there for the longest time, just looking, the archivist said. Then she smiled, not sad exactly, but like someone remembering something from very long ago. She touched her fingertips to the glass and said, "Some stories are better left untold, but that doesn't make them any less true." The woman never returned to the archives, and no record exists of her name or where she came from. Like so much in this story, she remains another fragment, another whisper, another echo of a past that refuses to remain buried despite all efforts to silence it. In the end, perhaps that is the most disturbing aspect of the Ashford Hayes case. The persistence of human connection against all odds, the refusal of love, whatever its nature, to obey the boundaries society constructs around it, in a world that insisted certain feelings could not, should not exist. Catherine and Daniel created a space for themselves anyway, first in secret rooms and coded glances, later in a life built far from everyone who knew them, and finally in the scattered traces they left behind. Fragments that, pieced together, still have the power to unsettle us today. In Charleston, on certain May nights when the air is heavy with jasmine and history, tour guides still point to Meeting Street and speak in hushed tones of the widow who scandalized society. Some claim to have seen lights moving in empty buildings, heard the faint sound of poetry being recited, felt a sudden chill in the humid air. These are just stories, of course embellishments meant to entertain tourists seeking a brush with the mysterious past. But beneath these ghost stories lies something far more unsettling. The knowledge that the past is never as simple as we wish it to be, that human hearts have always defied the categories constructed to contain them, and that somewhere, perhaps the descendants of Catherine Ashford and Daniel Hayes walk among us still, carrying a legacy of defiance in their very blood.